And here we are at the digestive system, part B. So in this section, we're going to talk about what actually takes place in the stomach, in the small intestine, large intestine, rectum, and anus. So here we are at the stomach. And the stomach is going to be receiving the bolus of food from the esophagus by peristalsis. And you have your gut brain, which you've talked about, and your central nervous system brain that we've talked about. But just to remember that the autonomic nervous system controls digestion. So sympathetic and parasympathetic branches are going to innervate the stomach and the small and large intestine. But what happens is that the sympathetic is actually going to inhibit the digestion, and parasympathetic is going to stimulate it. Part of that has to do with the fact that under normal conditions, you are going to want to couple certain activities in the body. So if you are running, for example, you want your cardiovascular and your respiratory system to really be stimulated, and the sympathetic nerve stimulation does that. But at the same time, you can't have everything going on at full tilt. So if you are running, you're not going to be digesting. You should have done that before running so that you now have the fuel. So digestion is going to be inhibited during that period of time. And if you've ever noticed, let's say at Thanksgiving, people will have a very large Thanksgiving meal and then put their feet up and watch a ball game. And that has to do with the fact that once you've eaten the food, the body wants to put its energy and its innervation into digesting and absorbing the food. So the parasympathetic is kind of the slow down type of thing. So the cardiovascular and the respiratory are going to be inhibited after a very large meal, but the parasympathetic is going to stimulate the digestion so that you do have the fuel, so that if later you want to go out and run a 10K, you'd be able to do that. So it's flipped a bit. So the stomach, once it gets the bolus of food, is going to start churning, and it's going to release hydrochloric acid, and it's going to release a digestive enzyme called pepsin. And you have specialized cells in that mucosal layer in the stomach that is going to contain these specialized chief cells, which produce an inactive pepsinogen. And then there are going to be parietal cells that release the hydrochloric acid into the stomach. And the gastric pits are where the chief cells produce the pepsinogen and the parietal cells produce the hydrochloric acid. And then when the gastric pits contract, they shoot up the hydrochloric acid and now the active pepsin into the body of the stomach. The whole idea is that you want to digest the food that you've eaten and not the cells, because your cells are made up of organic compounds just as the food is. So in this way, you are going to guarantee that the pepsin and the hydrochloric acid are acting on the food in the stomach and not starting to auto-digest the stomach. And once that gets going, that mixture of food and hydrochloric acid and pepsin is called chyme, C-H-Y-M-E, which should be on the next slide. Oh, next slide is a diagram of the stomach. So I'm not going to get into a lot of the labeling of this. There's just a few areas that I'd like to emphasize. So you've got your esophagus, and the food comes into the stomach. You do have folding to increase surface area, and that is beneath that are the gastric pits that produce the pepsin and hydrochloric acid. And then the food mixes with that, and you start to get partial breakdown. Your proteins get broken down into polypeptide chains. Now, the rest of the food is going to have to move into the small intestine to be further broken down or starting to be broken down. So this chyme passes through a sphincter called the pyloric sphincter. It acts as a valve because depending on how much you've eaten, depending on what you've eaten, is going to depend on how quickly you want to move that food out of the stomach into the small intestine. Food that is heavy in protein and fat moves slowly and are going to slowly be pulsed through the pyloric sphincter into the small intestine. If you eat just carbohydrates like a slice of bread, that would be able to be pulsed through very quickly. And here you have the first part of the small intestine is called the duodenum. All right, so this is just showing you the gastric pits. So the mucosal layer does dip down into these gastric pits that then face the stomach once they contract. And the importance of that is that the epithelial cells lining the stomach produce a lot of mucus to protect the stomach lining from the harsh acids. And the other part is that your parietal and your chief cells are wanting to either produce something inactive like pepsinogen that will get activated into pepsin once it reaches the stomach. The hydrochloric acid, again, you want to produce these and then quickly have the smooth muscle contract and shoot that into the body or the stomach to meet the food and not to auto-digest. And that's the only thing I want you to see in this particular slide. Okay, and there we go. So we've got the chyme. The only thing you actually digest is a partial digestion of the proteins into polypeptide chains. And then everything else has to go through the pyloric sphincter to reach the small intestine. The first part of the small intestine is called the duodenum. The second part is the jejunum, and the third part is the ileum. The importance of the duodenum is that it is connected to the gallbladder and the pancreas via a common duct, and you are going to be able to release inactive pancreatic enzymes and bile from the gallbladder into the duodenum via this common duct. Bile is made by the liver, stored in the gallbladder, and the function of the bile is to emulsify fats. Fats are pretty dense, and if you start to break them down with this detergent like bile, then you've got smaller little fat goblets or droplets that then can be acted on by pancreatic lipases, and you'll end up getting more caloric bang for your buck that way. And of course, the pancreatic enzymes make everything inactive first because, again, they don't want to auto-digest themselves. And you're going to find out that in the duodenum there is an activation process so that, again, the digestive enzymes act on the food and not on the organs that produce the digestive enzymes. So what will happen in the duodenum, or the first part of the small intestine, is on this slide. Here we go. So digestion and absorption occurs in the small intestine. Remember that the food that we eat is too large. So we want to take our pancreatic digestive enzymes mainly, and you have pancreatic amylases that will break down carbose into simple sugars, and that can be absorbed. Polypeptides are broken down into amino acids by pancreatic proteases, so the amino acids can be absorbed into the bloodstream. Lipids and fats are broken down into fatty acids and glycerol after the emulsification by bile, and that can be then absorbed. Nucleic acids can be broken down by nucleases, which then can be absorbed. So all of these monomers are just broken down into monomers that can be absorbed and then disseminated to every cell in the body. So then the monomers are absorbed either into the blood or the lymph circulation. Now, we know that then that blood travels to the liver to be detoxified and microbes be removed. But now what is actually in addition going to happen in the small intestine has to do with some regulation and some neutralization. The pancreas has to produce sodium bicarbonate, which enters the duodenum to neutralize the strong stomach acids, since pancreatic digestive enzymes cannot function at an acidic pH. Again, if I had some control over evolution, I would definitely change all of this. But the fact is that the proteases in the stomach only work under acidic pH. All of the pancreatic enzymes only work at neutral pH. So you have to have something to neutralize the hydrochloric acid in the chyme before the pancreatic enzymes can break down all the other complex compounds into monomers. So hence sodium bicarbonate one more time. Small intestine can also produce hormones locally to aid with that gut-brain in analyzing how much a person has eaten and what they've eaten as far as their carbs, protein, and fat content. So your localized hormones of digestion work with the gut-brain to do that. In addition, you want to have a lot of surface area so you get more bang for your buck. And the small intestine have a lot of these finger-like projections called villi, and they actually have microvilli on the villi, and that will maximize the surface area to maximize absorption. All right, now our large intestine. The large intestine has nothing to do with digestion and absorption. It has to do with what to do with the parts of the meal that is not going to be able to be broken down. Remember that nothing in the body works at 100% efficiency. And when you swallow, you start peristalsis. And yes, you can control how quickly or slowly the peristalsis moves the food, but you always have to move that food, so that there's only a certain amount of time that you have to break down the polymers into monomers and absorb them. And that is going to occur in the small intestine, and then what does not get broken down will move into the large intestine. And the large intestine is loaded with coliform bacteria that absolutely adore what I will now call feces. And the main reason why you have so many coliform bacteria is, again, you do not eat sterile food. The liver is going to protect you for the monomers that get into the blood, and the coliform bacteria protect you against any bacteria that remain in the undigested food. You can have food poisoning bacteria, and if you have a healthy gut, coliform growth of bacteria in there, then a lot of times you just will have the salmonella pass through and you're not affected. So that is one of the big reasons for the large intestine and the coliform bacteria. The other thing that the large intestine have are specialized sieve cells, and they will absorb any excess water that might be in the food. Think about eating watermelon, for example. It has a high water content, and the food always, or let's say the body always wants to absorb and retain as much fluid as possible in order not to desiccate. So these sieve cells will make sure that they absorb enough so that the feces still is moving, but not so much that you have diarrhea. Then the feces is going to, because peristalsis is still going on, enter the rectum, and that will later be released by defecation through the anus. And that's it for digestion. So once you've done and looked at the 2 PowerPoints and listened to the 2 lectures, it's time for Moodle quiz.